Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 54, Black Douglas. William Douglas was known as Black Douglas in the gold rush days of colonial Australia. He was labelled the terror of the goldfields in Victoria in the 1850s and became one of Australia's best known criminals at this time, decades before Ned Kelly made his mark. William Douglas was described as a convict, a sailor, a hard drinker, a prize fighter, a repeat reoffender, and a phrenologist, a reader of skulls, a beggar and a bushranger. Phrenologists believe that a person's intellect and personality could be predicted by studying the shape of a head. The science of phrenology was hugely popular in the 1800s. Phrenologists would read a patient's head by running their fingertips and palms over the skull. Bumps or depressions suggested aspects of personality and attributes, both positive and negative. A protruding forehead, for example, was thought to indicate an impressive intellect. A bump on the crown was a sign of morality. William Douglas seemed to also have several aliases in his life. Alexander Douglas, Charles Douglas, Black Scott Douglas, and Charles Russell were all names that it seems William Douglas used, particularly going from colony to colony. And in those days, quite often, bushrangers and other lawless men would alternatively use names to see if they could avoid the courts, so there wasn't a trail behind them. Douglas was emancipated from Philadelphia, USA. He lived in the Cinque Port town of Rye in England, as well as New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land and Victoria in Australia. So William Douglas was born in Philadelphia in 1817 into one of the first generations of black people in the state to be legally free from slavery and enforced labour. He was a Protestant who could read and write. Before turning 18, he became a sailor, working as a cook. On the 7th of January 1835, he stood trial for larceny in the English town of Rye at the age of 18. He was convicted of stealing coats. He was sentenced to 7 years' transportation and left on the ship, the Marquess of Huntley, and arrived in New South Wales on the 5th of July 1835. His convict register describes him as 5'8", with curly brown hair and brown eyes. His complexion was recorded as mulatto. This denotes a person that has both black and white ancestry, though he was pale enough for freckles to be seen on his skin. His nose was broad and his breast was covered in numerous scars. He had several tattoos, including a half moon and 3 dots on his lower left arm and an anchor on the back of his left hand. And his occupation at the time of his conviction was cook/indoor servant. His conduct record was quite detailed. On the 28th of November 1835, so within a few months of arriving, he received 50 lashes from being absent from work. 4 years later, on the 4th of March 1839, he received 50 lashes for insolence. 4 days after that incident, he received another 50 lashes for his conduct. A few months later, on the 17th of September 1839, he received 36 lashes for neglect of duties. And in the 25th of May 1840, he received 50 lashes for neglect of work. And on the 1st of June 1841, 50 lashes. On the 18th of August 1841, he was tried in Sydney and sentenced to a further 10 years and was transferred to Cockatoo Island on the 25th of October 1841. Why was he transferred to Cockatoo Island? Well, there was a small article mentioning that John Wood and William Douglas were charged with assaulting and robbing James Healy. The prosecutor was going home in his cart with his wife and daughter when 2 men stopped the cart at the 7 Mile Hollow. He recognised Wood, but Douglas, who was a man of colour, had a black handkerchief over his face, but the prosecutor knew him to be a man of colour by his hands. They were guilty and sentenced to 10 years. Black Douglas was then transferred to Van Diemen's Land in March 1842 on the Marion Watson on 3 years probation. And once he came to Van Diemen's Land, his record became quite lengthy. On the 4th of June, 1844, so 2 years after he arrived, he was on the gang. And on the 12th of April, 1845, he became insolent towards his master at Glenorchy. On the 25th of June, 1845, he received 7 days solitary confinement. A few weeks later, on the 21st of July, 1845, drunk and using obscene language, he got 3 months further hard labour. On the 5th of August, 1845, at Glenorchy, misconduct, 7 days solitary confinement. On the 12th of August, 1845, he was listed as insubordinate and his sentence was extended by a further 9 months. On the 12th of September, 1845, disorderly conduct and a further month of hard labour in chains. On the 4th of October, 1845, having tobacco in his possession, in chains and his sentence extended by 1 month. On the 2nd of January, 1846, he refused to work and received 1 month hard labour in chains. On the 23rd of January, 1846, he was on 4 months probation. But by the August 1846, he was charged with being disorderly and received 4 days solitary confinement. 3 weeks later, on the 2nd of September 1846, misconduct, and he received 7 days solitary confinement. And by November 1846, again misconduct and obscene language, and he was back in chains. So he was still in chains 2 years later, in April 1848, doing hard labour. By November 1848, he was absent without leave and received a further month hard labour. On the 14th of December 1848, there was an application for a ticket of leave, which was refused. On the 4th of April 1849, disorderly, riotous and obscene language, 6 months hard labour. And in that same month, stopping work with a frivolous plea of sickness, another month added on to hard labour. By the December of 1849, he absconded and he received 14 days solitary confinement for that. 2 months later, on the 14th of February 1850, disobeying orders, 4 months hard labour. On the 20th of April 1850, obscene language and threatening to strike a fellow prisoner, 14 days solitary confinement. On the 4th of September 1850, he was employed by Richard Chips at Launceston. However, by the 28th of September, he was a principal player in a fight and received 4 months hard labour. The details of that fight were outlined in the Bell's Sporting Chronicle of the time on the 26th of October 1850. It's titled The Ring, gallant fight in Van Diemen's Land between Bob Fee of Sheffield and Black Douglas of Sydney. The known capabilities of these men rendered the above event of no slight degree of interest. Both have proved themselves game and scientific. The difference in weight, Douglas being upwards of 13 stone and Fee only 11 stone 9 pounds, led the betting men to lay their money out 6-4 pretty freely on the darkie, and they were the more inclined to be sweet upon him as he was much taller and longer in reach than his antagonist. The sharp blades of Sheffield, however, refused to leave their countrymen in the lurch and accepted the odds with considerable avidity. Fee's a fine, active young man, the heavy hitter with his right, and will prove a teaser to any who may feel inclined to meet him. The darkie disappointed his friends and certainly did not come up to his previous efforts or impress his backers with an opinion that he was fit to enter the ring with such a man as John Perry. At one time it was talked of, now it has ceased to be, nor is he likely to be back to fight any man in Van Diemen's Land. He has slid down the ladder of the PR reputation at a breakneck pace. Again, on February 1851, he was present at a prize fight, and for disobeying orders, he was returned. And on the 19th of July 1851, he was discharged from service, and the note was not to be hired again in the district of Fingal. So in his time from March 1842 through to July 1851, so nearly 10 years, his sentence just kept getting extended due to his poor behaviour. However, he did get his certificate of freedom on the 5th of September 1851, and on the 13th of September 1851, William's sentence expired in Van Diemen's Land. He left Launceston on the 19th of September on the City of Melbourne as a passenger labelled as free by servitude. Once he arrived in Victoria, his habits unfortunately continued. Douglas had a gang together and they started to rob miners soon after gold was discovered in Victoria in 1851. And in that year, a military officer reported that this notorious ruffian had been seen carrying on his shoulders the dead body of a man who was doubtless one of his victims. The Black Forest that stood between Melbourne and the diggings at Bendigo and Mount Alexander was considered his favourite haunt. There were some articles with some recollections, and one of those recollections took it back to October 1851. And this man had recalled that we had partaken in our dinner, and I was sitting at the door of our mansion enjoying a quiet smoke when in the distance I saw a crowd gathering. But as it was close under the camp, I thought it might be for afternoon worship, and taking a stroll down towards the people, I soon found my mistake, and that was an assemblage of a totally different character. Oaths of the most disgusting and vile character were heard on all hands. "I'll bet on the black boy," said one. "I'll lay 2-1 on Bolton," said another. And so they betted, quarrelled, almost fought amongst themselves as to the merits of the two men who had evidently arranged a prize fight. A fellow who had rendered himself notorious as a blackguard of the worst kind in the criminal annals of the colony, an American Negro, Black Douglas by name, a name to be made still more infamous by a black list of crimes, had challenged another man as detestable as himself to a prize fight, and now, on this day, they were about to perpetrate one of the grossest pieces of brutality it is possible for human nature to descend to. The crowd surged and moved on to a point just below where Grapes Hotel now stands. Here a ring was formed, seconds appointed, and all the brutal details of the prize fight enacted. In January 1852, there was another account from a man at the diggings. I was surrounded by about 50 men who had all been stuck up, one dray after another, 14 of them, by Black Douglas's mob. I think that the mob managed to get 30 or 40 pounds of sterling amongst the lot, and they looked very sheepish the next morning to think that 50 men had been robbed by 7 armed bushrangers. And this is where we start to find some newspaper articles outlining his exploits. On the 16th of April, 1852, so about 7 months after he arrived in Victoria, William Douglas, alias Black Douglas, pleaded not guilty to an indictment charging him with assaulting, on the 23rd of January, Mr. John Tucker, the Chief Constable of Kyneton, while in charge of a prisoner. The verdict was guilty of common assault. On the 22nd of April 1852, William Douglas, alias Black Douglas, convicted of common assault. The prisoner, on being asked if he had anything to urge why judgment should not be passed according to law, pleaded the long period he had already been in confinement and the hardships he has undergone since his arrest. He had been kept without food and chained to trees without sufficient shelter from the weather, and all this before he had been brought to trial, and consequently, when according to law he was to be considered innocent, the sentence was 2 months' imprisonment. On the 4th of March 1852, only 3 weeks later, the notorious Black Douglas was captured yesterday, an African black who had stabbed his mate. They will make their appearance in Melbourne on Tuesday next. So on the 15th of April 1852, another article records, William Douglas, alias Black Douglas, pleaded not guilty to an indictment charging him with assaulting on the 23rd of January in Kyneton one John Tucker, the said John Tucker being a constable and at the time of the assault being in the execution of his duty. Mr. John Tucker, the Chief Constable at Kyneton, stated on the 23rd of January, a man named Fay was given into his custody on charge of stealing gold. He was on his way to the watch house with Fay when the prisoner Douglas came up to him and, taking Fay by the arm, said that the witness should not take him to the watch house. Douglas got into the face of the witness and threatened to use the cudgeon if Fay was not released. Fay then began to struggle, and with the resistance of the prisoners, they effected his escape. The prisoner, who was undefended, cross-examined Mr. Tucker with great tact. It was elicited that Tucker was armed with a loaded revolver pistol when Fay was rescued, but that he didn't use it. The prisoner, in addressing the jury, had a strong position on this first point and contended that it was impossible that he could have rescued the prisoner from an armed constable, except the latter was a coward. The verdict was guilty for common assault. On the 20th of May 1852, when the prisoner was conveyed to the watch house, he had been rescued by the rest of his gang, headed by a Negro, a well-known character of gigantic proportions going by the name of Black Douglas. This open act of defiance to the law occurred in broad daylight and within 3 miles of the mounted police station at Carlsruhe. On the 22nd of June 1852, an article titled "Fight with the Police." Yesterday afternoon in Elizabeth Street was the scene of one of the most desperate rows that ever disgraced the city. It appears that the police were endeavouring to arrest a notorious vagabond who rejoices in the sobriquet of Black Douglas for drunkenness and disorderly conduct when they were savagely attacked by 30 or 40 of his associates, including the greatest ruffians in town, and severely ill-used. The scoundrels would, doubtless, have succeeded in rescuing their companion had it not been for the timely arrival of a number of mounted police, who were compelled to use the flats of their swords to compel the crowd of scoundrels to disperse. Douglas himself was particularly violent and succeeded in keeping 5 policemen at bay until knocked down by a severe blow on the back of his head. He will make his appearance at the City Police Court this morning in company with one of his sympathising friends, who was particularly prominent in obstructing the constables in their duty. It is to be regretted that there is every probability of their escaping with a punishment utterly inadequate to their offence, as we believe the magistrates have no option but to deal summarily with the case. He pops up again a few months later on the 4th of August 1852, Black Douglas again. This notorious character with 2 of his comrades, one a blackfellow, were captured by the police in Kyneton on Sunday afternoon on a charge of passing Don Havana flash notes. They were, after a little difficulty, secured and marched off to the station house. They were brought before the police magistrate at Kyneton on Monday. 26th of November 1852, sly grog selling. The notorious Black Douglas was seized last week at the Bendigo diggings with a large cargo of spirits in his dray for traffic amongst the diggers. The whole was seized and the owner marched down to Melbourne handcuffed. A couple of weeks later, 8th of December 1852, 8 prisoners were received at the jail here on Saturday from Ballarat, 3 of whom, and one of these, notorious Black Douglas, having been committed under the Vagrant Act for grog selling. One man is under committal for a charge of murder, an Aboriginal native, and the others for different kinds of felony. In June 1853, a notorious desperado who chiefly displays his abilities in the horse-stealing line and who is known in these parts as Black Douglas, was arrested on Friday evening at Ferguson's Inn by one of the Kilmore police. I have found when researching other Australian bushrangers that there is a common theme, that they seem to be very charming and they're certainly good with the gift of the gab. And it was mentioned earlier how he presented himself in court with great tact. Well, this article really does outline how well William Douglas spoke. And this article was presented in the Argus on the 8th of February 1854, and it's outlining the Ballarat Quarter Sessions. The title of this article is Robbery with Violence. Alexander Douglas, so celebrated in the colony as Black Douglas, was charged with the above crime. Robert Roberts says, "I'm a medical man. I remember on the 10th of December passing Tate's store to Joyce's tent. In between sundown and dark, I met the prisoner coming in the opposite direction. I paused, and so did he. He said he wanted to have a chat. I gave him a shove and he fell. He rose and seized me by the foot. We struggled for 5 minutes. He struck me over the right eye with his fist, with a blow that resulted in me bleeding freely. I was not laid up with it. The mark is still on my face. He dragged me onto the road. We were then separated. I afterwards put my hands into my pocket and I found a leather bag containing 8 sovereigns gone. I am positive I had it when I left Tate's tent. I asked persons to search the place of the scuffle, but it was not to be found. The prisoner was sober enough to know what he was doing. Prisoner stated, "You seized me. You said you wanted a chat. You did not demand money of me. I pushed you down and got clear of you. You were very drunk. I do not know what your intention was. I stood afterwards in Joyce's doorway. I said before the magistrate, I struck you as hard as I could to get rid of you. You said nothing about robbery. The prisoner cross-examined the prosecutor, not only with the ability, but with the air of an experienced counsel. Sergeant Mackenzie stated, I received information and apprehended the prisoner 3 hours after a search. By prisoner, I apprehended you and you appeared drunk. I took you to Torrance's store. I searched you. I found 4 £1 notes, 1 sovereign and 16 shillings on you. Crown prosecutor stated there are about 400 yards between the place of the scuffle and the place of the search. Prisoner addressed the jury in a speech of great ability. While dwelling upon the point that he had no legal assistance, it was evident that there was not much loss to him from the case being in his own hands. He said that his character had been much prejudiced by vile rumours and reports, and he then read the following singular document written by himself. It is as follows. Your Honour and Gentlemen, being placed at the bar of this tribunal and permitted by law to defend myself, I must, in justice to myself, digress from the present case. My character requires justification, and I cannot attempt to defend myself without bringing that character before your notice, for it is by public exposition alone that it can be possibly justified. I have been 2 years in the colony of Victoria, having arrived here from Van Diemen's Land, where certainly I admit having carried on a pugilistic profession, in other words, a boxer. But with all my publicity, there is not the slightest record in that country to tax me with any crime or any offence. Now consider, gentlemen, that a government and a large population that has never recognised crime or an offence against me for the space of 10 years, residents amongst them how truly upright must have been my moral character. As a matter of frequent occurrence, I have often been urged into the prize ring, and there, gentlemen, I have gained that petty renown which at first gave popularity to my name. In all these encounters, I have been strongly opposed by a certain party of oppositionists, whose losses have been great in consequence of their often bringing and backing men to encounter and defeat me. Severe losses on their side and a series of success on mine have caused the most terrible feelings to exist, which was certainly sprung up into a most unmanly, unchristian-like persecution that almost ever existed. The breaking out of the goldfields brought a number of people from Van Diemen's Land to this country, which gave an opportunity to my persecutors to arrive here on Ballarat. Some of them had located themselves, and even in a strange country, they were determined to either crush my fame as a pugilist or blast my character as an honest man. Thus, then, gentlemen, I have shown you the nature from which all my defamation of character arises. Now I shall lay before you those imaginary crimes. There was a report that I was captain of 4 armed banditti in the Black Forest. It was publicly rumoured that I have been seen carrying the body of a dead commissioner in a sack. There was a report that I got 21 years. There was a report that I had escaped from Pentridge, a place I never saw, with 3 bullets in my body. All these scandalous reports have militated against me. And the notes say from the reporter, continued the prisoner with great pathos and eloquence. And thus a man from no crime whatever has been vilified and abused. What use was it for him to do good if he were continually liable to this persecution and dismissed from time to time penniless and dependent on his friends? The Honour summed up, during which the prisoner with great coolness and decorum corrected his Honour as to one of his notes of evidence. During his summing up, His Honour remarked that the prisoner's defence of that day would not have disgraced the best barrister in that court. The jury retired and in a quarter of an hour returned and found the prisoner guilty of common assault only. His Honour sentenced the prisoner to 1 year's imprisonment with hard labour. So despite the judge being quite impressed with his statements, the jury did come back with a verdict, and very interesting how he has made claims against some of the crimes that he was caught for. I think he was just trying his very best to get himself out of a sticky situation, and make note too that he used the name Alexander Douglas in this case. Then in November 1854, Black Douglas, this noted character, will be brought up at the police court today on a charge of drunkenness. We have been informed that he was only let out of prison on Saturday, having undergone 12 months imprisonment for an assault committed at Ballarat. No sooner was he at liberty than he proceeded to get intoxicated. He first created a disturbance at the Watchmakers Arms Hotel in Carrara Street East. He then visited the Royal Mail and finally went to Sir Charles Hotham Hotel in Ballerine Street, where he conducted himself in such a manner that he was given into custody. In 1855, the Geelong Advertiser reported that Black Douglas's gang had kept the entire neighbourhoods in a state of terror and apprehension for several weeks. On the 6th of May 1885, miners finally captured Douglas and his gang. Foster argues that the recent murder of a defenceless white woman at Avoca was the impetus for the vigilant action, and it is outlined in an article on the 10th of May 1855. Without exception, these are the quietest diggings on which I was ever located, although there are a considerable number of rowdies and of the worshippers of the jolly god. Grog tents and tents of a certain description are by no means unfrequent, but until last night nothing had occurred to warrant any notice. The affair was as follows. Rumours of a sticking up between this and New Bendigo had reached us in the course of last week, and the miscreants who perpetrated these outrages were suspected of being hanging about in this neighbourhood. Black Douglas and some of his gang had been seen about, and as I hear, proceeded to stick up a tent somewhere near the camp, when the authorities, being informed of the circumstance last night, proceeded to seize them, but being unable, through the paucity of their numbers, called on the diggers to help them, which they did to a number of about 400. They captured the Douglas and 5 of his party and marched them off to the Maryborough lockup. Not content with this, the diggers proceeded to tear down a tent of the disreputable character where these worthies had been residing, but on the promise of the inmates to remove in 24 hours, they desisted. It's doubtless that the bushrangers will have pitched its camp elsewhere. Apparently there was a lynching that was averted after the policemen convinced the miners it was in their best interest to bring in Douglas and his men to face British justice. Douglas consequently was sentenced to 2 years hard labour. And one report said it will give very general satisfaction to the public to be informed that the career of this notorious criminal and his mates in crime has sustained a check. The result of this was conviction of being on a premises without a lawful excuse. Around the late 1880s, there were a number of articles that had people putting in reminiscences about that time of the Bendigo diggings and when William Douglas was prominent with his gang. At this point, he was known as Charles Russell. So it says, Charles Russell, a man of very questionable integrity, led a troublesome life and went into a campaign of lawlessness in colonial Victoria during the 1850s at the height of one of the greatest gold rushes in the world. One time he robbed 16 people and chained them to a log. Some of the gold diggers avoided travelling with their newly found gold. The roads were way too dangerous, with bushrangers threatening to steal their valuables. Black Douglas and his gang would also rob the tents of miners during the day while they were busy digging for gold. And there was a detailed reminiscence from J.M. Barr in 1887 in a number of instalments in newspapers. J.M. Barr was John Mitchell Barr. He was a miner, a politician and a journalist who was Scottish, and he arrived in Melbourne in 1853 and soon went with a party to the Bendigo goldfields. For several years, he followed the rushes around Ballarat and Bendigo with varying luck, and he eventually settled at McCallum's Creek near Maryborough in Victoria. He began dairying and he ran sheep and cattle for a time, but in spite of the good fortune in mining, losses of stock through disease forced him to sell out. In 1863, Barr exhausted his capital and had to give up mining as his debts increased, and he joined the Mallorca and Carisbrook Independent as a reporter and then became editor. In 1881, he sold this business and entered a partnership with the Williamstown Advertiser as an editor. And in 1883, he started the Footscray Independent and its editor, and he contributed to the press with many original tales, poems and sketches of life on the goldfields. So this is his account of his time in the Bendigo and District goldfields at the time that Black Douglas was there. And it says, it was while partaking a drink of a beer at the shanty that the first mention of the noted bushranger Black Douglas was made in our hearing. A drayman who had been up and was returning from the rush remarked that a party of miners from Mount McIver had arrived at the diggings that morning and had been stuck up the previous day by Black Douglas and his gang, and they were robbed of up to £200. And on one of the men resisting the searching process, unceremoniously felled him to the earth. One after another of those present joined in the conversation and gave further particulars of the outrages of the gang, who appeared to have made a dense scrub about 2 miles in advance of the present camp, their headquarters, from which they made excursions every few days, robbing and afterwards maltreating every person they met with. Many were the maledictions bestowed upon the miscreants by the crowd of draymen and diggers assembled at the shanty, and deep were the threats of what they would do if they'd only get a chance to get a shot of their scoundrels. While one great Yorkshire man was expressing his desire that the office of the hangman to the wretches was given to him, I caught a glimpse of a sneering, scornful and savage expression on the by no means handsome countenance of the shanty keeper. This made me feel a thrill of positive horror, for the transient glimpse had revealed a look so profound in his devilish cruelty and cunning that I was intuitively warned that the bushrangers may have an active sympathiser in our host. Returning to our drays, I cautiously told the party what I had seen, and we organised a plan of keeping watch by turns during the night. We also mentioned this to some of the other miners camped near us and moved our drays near each other in a circle, tying the horses within the enclosure. About 8 o'clock, most of the fires burnt low and silence reigned over the camp. Tom took the first watch with a double-barrelled musket and a revolver ready for use, and I lay down to sleep till 2 o'clock, when my turn came and I was awakened to act as a sentry. I was soon ready, and Tom handed me the weapon, saying in a tired whisper, "It is all quiet as yet. Good morning." I sat down under the overhanging tarpaulin. The dew was falling heavily, and I listened to the ceaseless chirp of insects, the mournful wail of birds, and the occasional yelp of a dingo. Suddenly, the clink of a stirrup awoke my senses to acuteness, and I saw cautiously coming out of the bush towards the shanty a line of 6 horsemen, gliding across like shadows in the heavy grass, in silence. The back entrance was thrown open and one rider dismounted and entered the hut, while the rest remained on horseback near the door. In about 10 minutes, the shanty keeper came out and a bottle was passed around for each rider to drink. 2 or 3 bundles of stores were handed up on the saddles, and then the leader came out and a whispered conference ensued. I saw our late host pointing several times to where tents and drays were standing in the moonlight, and I was apprehensive that an attack was almost to be made. My hand was under the cover to shake my mate when the leader jumped on horseback, and as he turned away, the moon revealed a dark and massive countenance with a thick curling black beard. I knew by the description of Black Douglas. Back into the bush went the riders, their forms gradually melting from view, and Tom slept on while I uncocked the musket and continued my watch. Breakfast was over and we were ready for a start when we saw the carrier return without his horses. He came at a shambling trot to where we stood, the perspiration standing in great beads on his face, and he seemed perfectly exhausted and could only gasp out, "Robbed of all I had got from that dastard Black Douglas." He was in a fearful state of exhaustion, and we all waited anxiously to hear his tale before starting on the road. At length, he informed us that 2 of his horses could not have been securely tied, and they had got away during the night. He found their tracks and followed them for about a mile when he saw them in a small flat feeding with several others. That just as he was approaching them, a man on horseback with a black crape mask on galloped up to him, presented a revolver and demanded his money. Being completely unarmed, his pistols left at the wagon, he had no option but to comply and hand over £7 in notes and silver, which he had in a chamois leather bag. This was accepted and looked over, and then the rider sharply asked for the rest of his money, adding with another, "Hand it out quick and no shenanigans." In vain the carrier affirmed that the sum given was all he had. The answer was, "If you don't produce the bit of dirty rag with the notes in it, you're a dead man in 5 minutes. If you attempt to get away or call for assistance, I'll send 6 bullets through you in a jiffy." And I gave him the rag, which I wore hung around my neck with a lanyard. And it had £142 in it, which was all the money I had saved for 3 years. Curse him. I've been spotted somewhere, for I'll swear that I never showed it to any living one, not even my mate, since I left Melbourne. And now what on earth will I do? I would as soon shoot myself as not. Oh, if only I could meet that black-faced wretch on equal terms, away from all his mates, the wretches who kept peeping from behind the trees at us, and I would take it out of him if I was hung for the next day. Intelligence was received during the day that 3 drays and about a dozen men and women had been stuck up and robbed about a mile from the diggings by Black Douglas and his gang. Again we started, and this time we might have made 15 miles from the diggings and had passed the ruins of the shanty where Yorkie so nearly met his fate, when a boy came in sight riding as hard as the heavy horse he bestrode could be forced to go with whip and spur. As he neared us we noticed the wild, scared look of the lad and the foam dropping from the horse, and the perspiration in great beads on the forehead of the rider, while his parched lips could scarcely form the words that shrieked rather than said, "Murder, murder, a woman has been shot dead about a mile on by Black Douglas." We naturally desired to know all the particulars, which the boy gave in his own strange manner, the substance being that he, with 3 women, had left a dray load of grog encamped a short distance from the road, while the men of the party went on to the rush with the other dray, and that while the women were sitting at dinner under a roughly erected tent, 6 men on horseback galloped up and commenced to levy contributions from each individual of the party. 2 of the women gave up all they had in haste to get rid of the unwelcome intruders, but the third, the most lady-looking of the 3, gave a purse containing a little under £5. This was far from satisfying the robbers, who bade her at once to hand out the rest of her money and save them the trouble of searching her. Womanlike, she at once fired up and launched forth with bitter language on her assailants, calling them scum of the earth, old lags, lifers from the other side, and mean white-livered thieves. "Hold your jaw," roared the man, who stood before her with a pistol in hand, "and shell out, or maybe we'll be a little worse than you have called us," at the same time putting forward his hand as if to search the bosom of her dress. The woman recoiled, and with her hand struck his that was outstretched towards her. He raised the pistol angrily, but one of the interposed, saying, "Now, missus, you had better give up what you have, for Jim won't be trifled with." "Who is going to stand here all day after a woman like this?" hissed the other, and advanced rapidly, caught the woman's hand, and added, "Give me the money, or I'll shoot you dead." The woman laughed scornfully, and with her disengaged hand tapped him over the face. It was but a second, and the deadly tube was levelled at her head, not more than a pace distant, and a gush of flame following, a crack, and the woman lay writhing, shot through the head. The murderer stooped down, pushed his hand into her bosom, and drew forth a roll of notes in a chamois bag, just as one of the gang came up cursing. "What in the name made you shoot the woman? Why not tie her up? You cur, one of us will swing for this day's work yet. You were always a cruel brute, and I'm sorry you ever joined us." "What else was I going to do?" was the retort. "I'm too well known to leave you, and we'll have to sink or swim together." The leader then ordered some of the grog to be taken from the drays, and leaving the 2 other women in stupid fear, the men rode off. And then the boy added, "I crept out from under the blankets where I was hidden by my mother, and caught one of the horses to go and tell my father and Bill, the husband of the woman who was killed. Suddenly I could see from the dray a rather tall man who opened the inner door and came out leisurely into the butcher's shop. I saw the dark countenance fringed with the black and curly hair, and yelled like a manman, 'Look to the shop, Black Douglas will escape.' He started, made a run for it, and was lighting his way through a mass of men that filled the shop. I saw a revolver fired, and then a tall fellow with a stroke that would have felled an ox sent Black Douglas reeling to the earth with a blow from a butcher's cleaver. The excitement was intense. It appeared as if the crowd around Black Douglas and the shanty keeper would tear the men in pieces, and before the more peaceably disposed of the miners could interfere, a good deal of rough usage had already taken place. At length it was determined to carry the prisoners to the prison camp at Maryborough, and a dray being procured, the hands of the men were secured behind it. Round the dray went a motley crowd of miners, armed with all manner of weapons, from first-class revolvers and muskets to the rough pike or bayonet mounted upon a sapling handle. The vest and jumper of Black Douglas was torn into rags, and revealed through the gaping rents the yellow West Indian mulatto skin which had procured him for his distinctive name. Black Douglas rode on in silence, never replying to any of the taunts that were copiously launched at him, and scarcely even lifting his head to look around him. So as a result, being in 2 years jail, the next time we see an article is in February 1857. The Pentridge Stockade is clearing out its inmates before their full time is up. The notorious Black Douglas, so long a terror to the Northern Goldfields and who was arrested with his gang by the Maryborough and Elmer Protection Societies, has had his sentence shortened and is again let loose upon the community before his time. This desperado has broken out of almost every prison in the colony and slipped through the forms of many a trial by the sheer force of his own special pleading. When about the middle of 1855, Black Douglas was brought before P.D. Hall Hardy, Esquire, police magistrate for the district of Carisbrook, and he was sentenced to the longest term of imprisonment the bench could inflict upon the worst of characters, namely 2 years. To have sent the case before a court and jury would have given this bushranger too good a chance. The 2 years are not up, and yet he is out at liberty for good conduct. How long has the Pentridge Stockade been possessed of this reforming power? It is strange that at this critical juncture of the penal discipline question, more prisoners should be discharged before the expiration of their sentences than at any former period. The Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry and Citizens Committee should know the reason why. So a few months later, by May 1857, Black Douglas and his associates have been engaged in the ordinary business of easing travellers of whatever may be regarded as valuable, but as the police are on the alert, we hope the lawless band will eventually be kept in check. So only a month later, Alexander Douglas, well known as Black Douglas, was brought up by Constable John Swain, having been drunk and disorderly previously at the Star Hotel. It added, this daring and notorious ruffian was arrested in a state of intoxication and lodged in Her Majesty's lockup in the camp. It is a pity that he could not be kept in jail altogether. We understand he has been residing for some weeks previously at Tarawinji, which is just southeast of Wangaratta. There was an article a week later, on the 22nd of June 1857, Black Douglas at Yakadanda. Not many days ago, this notorious vagrant was sent to jail at Beechworth for the space of 3 days for drunken and disorderly conduct in this town. Our Yakadanda agent informs us that he was on the 11th brought up before the police court at that place and fined 5 shillings for a similar offence, the promise being extracted from him that he would leave the district. It is difficult to account for the wide difference between these two magisterial decisions, and it must, we imagine, puzzle Black Douglas not a little. We're inclined to think such lenient treatment is more likely to keep him in the district than to warn him against a prolonged stay, and that's in the Ovens Constitution. And it says, the career of the ferocious Black Douglas, whose suspicions caused him to gradually exterminate most of his gang with his own hand. So people were suspecting that the reason why he ended up in vagrancy, so nowhere to live, his depredations meant that most of the gang that he actually had with him early on in those previous 5 to 6 years, he'd actually simply exterminated one by one. You would have noticed there was a mention of William being referred to as Alexander Douglas. He actually has a jail record in 1855 where he is named Alexander Douglas. And in this jail record, it states that he was born in 1818 in London, so the year's very close. However, not the location. He was literate, and that does correlate, but he also states on this record that he was a boatman. The physical description, including his tattoos, do match William Douglas. There seems to be very little recorded on Black Douglas for nearly 20 years. When newspaper reports then start referring to Black Douglas as Charles Russell, or alternatively used with William Douglas, and even a combination of Charles Douglas. So from this time on, it seems that he'd laid low and he's made a decision to change his name in order to distance himself from his previous bushranging exploits. Another theory could be that he actually vacated Australia at this time, and there is a William Douglas mentioned on a shipping record with a birth year of 1818 at the age of 48, departing Victoria in June 1866 and destination New Zealand on the ship Ragatoto No. 2. So another theory could be that he actually went to New Zealand for a time and then returned to Australia. So an article does pop up on the 1st of February 1875 in the Herald in Melbourne, and it's a police article from the city. The Black Douglas. William Douglas is black-hearted. He tried to kill his wife. He will partake of the Douglas larder in jail for 12 months or find sureties in £20 for having made sanguinary threats of knives and revolvers. Now, this is the only record that I can find that he has family. In the inquest into his death, it actually states he has no relatives in the colony. However, I do have a theory that I will present at the end of the story and leave it up to you to decide. I'm assuming after that event that he decided to vacate Victoria fairly quickly, and in 1876 there is a record of him being jailed in New South Wales. He stated he was born in Philadelphia, USA, in that record, and that he came to Melbourne in 1852 on the President. And interestingly, at this time, he calls himself Charles Douglas. On the 14th of September 1882, he pops up in Shoalhaven, so near Nowra in New South Wales, and it says Shoalhaven Police Court. At the police court Nowra on Saturday, on the 9th, before Mr John Glanville, Charles Russell, alias Black Douglas, was charged with being drunk at Tarara and was fined 5 shillings or 24 hours in the lockup. The same offender was also fined 10 shillings for making use of obscene language at that same place. On Monday, before Brown and Glanville, E.J.H. Foster and Charles Russell, alias Black Douglas, were charged with behaving riotously in Hyam's billiard room and were each fined 10 shillings and 5 shillings cost of witness or 48 hours in the lockup. There is a jail record at Wollongong, recorded at this time in 1882, and his record states Charles Russell, alias Black Douglas, arrived on the President 1852 from the United States of America. Church of England labourer, 67 years, 5'9", and in the remarks it stated an American Indian. And just as an aside, he's stating that he came to Australia, Melbourne in particular, on the President in 1852, I'm assuming to cover up the fact that he'd actually been a convict and brought to New South Wales, then sent to Cockatoo Island and Tasmania. So he's just choosing to state that he didn't arrive in the country until 1852. Another interesting thing that pops up in this jail record is that in brackets it also has Albert Douglas. So yet another alias for William Douglas by the looks of it. 12 months later, he also appears. Charles Douglas, the coloured phrenologist, who has appeared so frequently before the local court, was ordered to be imprisoned for 1 month for making use of obscene language on the railway station, for assaulting a police constable, and the same defendant was sent to jail for 14 days. So at this stage, he's going in and out of jail for small periods. He then, on the 23rd of August 1884, pops up at Goulburn in New South Wales. Friday, August 22nd, before the police magistrate. Drunk and disorderly. Charles Douglas, alias Black Douglas, was charged with drunkenness and disorderly conduct. The accused is a coloured man and had come out of jail only on Thursday last, after 6 weeks' imprisonment for vagrancy. He pleaded to be allowed to leave the town and he would not be seen again. The police magistrate said, "I will give you another chance, but if you appear again, you will probably get 6 months. I am taking a great responsibility on myself in letting you go this time. You can now go," and the defendant responded with, "Thank you, your worship." In 1885, he was recorded as being jailed in New South Wales, and the particulars were he was named as Charles Douglas and where born, America, 67 years old and could read and write. On the 5th of June 1886, it was reported in the Melbourne Herald, an old coloured man named Charlie Russell, who was arrested on a charge of drunkenness, presented a pitiable appearance. He stated he was a phrenologist, recently arrived from Sydney and had nowhere to go. He had been arrested in Canning Street and was covered from head to foot in mud, and an old white bell topper which he wore was sadly knocked about. The bench decided to remand him for a week. The poor old fellow was suffering from sciatica and could scarcely limp across the floor of the court. In 1886, he was recorded as being jailed in Geelong. He's named himself Charles Douglas again. He was tried in Melbourne on the 22nd of July, 1886 for vagrancy. He received 2 months' jail. His particulars were born in America, labourer, born 1816, 5 foot 9.5, mulatto complexion, black and grizzly hair and black eyes, bald was the description with 2 previous convictions. There was yet another jail record recorded in Victoria in 1887. Again, he's using Charles Douglas as his name, and it's in Melbourne, and it states that on the 27th of November 1886 he was charged with being idle and disorderly. He received 12 months. This time he states that his birthplace is Boston. Born in 1816 and 5 foot 9.5. It says coloured man, bald, 3 previous convictions. He doesn't pop up again until 27th of January 1888. And it says, rumour has it that the old vagrant who received a sentence of a month at Seymour a few days ago was no other than the notorious Black Douglas, whose bushranging exploits caused a sensation a few years ago. So he's now back in Victoria. And then quite a few articles pop up in 1888. So a month later, 17th of February 1888, a coloured individual who styles himself a phrenologist, but better known in this district as Black Douglas, an old pugilist, or in other words, a boxer, who makes his appearance about once a year, was arrested at Violent Town on Wednesday night last for having worshipped at the shrine of Bacchus too frequently during the day. So in other words, drunkenness. 2 months later, on the 7th of April 1888, the reason that the main roads were avoided was that 2 or 3 gangs of bushrangers frequented them, and a notable character, the supposed leader of one of the gangs, was Black Douglas, who was an ex-convict from Tasmania. This man must have been ubiquitous, as he was supposed to commit depredations at 2 or 3 places at the same time. However, his name exercised a sort of terrorism, as he was held to be a most desperate character. An ex-fighting man, a drunkard, and a disreputable blackguard he certainly was, but too big a cur to make a bushranger. The most satisfactory manner of accounting for the robberies supposed to have been committed by him is that other coloured men were the actual perpetrators of most of the crimes imputed to him, and that his unenviable notoriety shielded them from detection. On one occasion he was detected at Fry's Creek stealing the carcass of a sheep from a butcher's shop and received a severe thrashing from the butcher and his man, so this and robberies of a similar character were about the extent to which he ventured as a lawbreaker. So an interesting take on it. It's the only reference that I've seen where they're saying that because of his colour, he could very well have been dealt with a lot more harshly and blamed for some crimes that he actually didn't commit. On the 4th of May 1888, Mr. Douglas, phrenologist, or as he is better known, Black Douglas, was brought up to the Seymour Police Court from Tallarook on Tuesday, charged with drunken disorderly conduct. The usual half-crown fine was inflicted and paid, after which the coloured gentleman of science walked down the street, a self-satisfied personification of injured innocence. However, it only took him a matter of days before he was jailed in Seymour. So it states Charles Douglas, prison number 21581 at Seymour on the 8th of May 1888 for larceny. He received 14 days. It states he was from America, born in 1816, 5 foot 7.5, coloured man with 6 previous convictions. And then on the 23rd of May 1888, he is reported as being in the Geelong jail. Charles Douglas, tried in South Melbourne on the 23rd of May 1888 as idle and disorderly. He received 6 months. It stated he was a native of America, a labourer, born in 1816, 5 foot 7.5, copper colour complexion, grey hair and brown eyes, several previous convictions. In December 1888, in the North Melbourne Advertiser, there was an article titled The Phrenologist. An elderly coloured man named James Russell, whose bearing and language bore witness to the fact that he was by no means lacking in education or a sense of decency, was charged with vagrancy. The old fellow made a profound bow to the bench and assured them that he was no vagrant, as he could earn his livelihood as a phrenologist. Other people are allowed to follow their professions, pleaded the defendant, and why should it not be lawful for me to follow mine? Constable Scannell said that Russell had been found lying on the footpath drinking water out of the gutter and was evidently in a very weak state. The defendant said, "I took a little drink and have a weak bump in my perineum, and when the constable saw me, I was recruiting myself." As the old man said he had a son at Castlemaine, a constable was directed to pack him off to that town by the next train. So this article alludes to a son in Castlemaine. So this is the first time that we've seen any evidence of William Douglas having children. There was a small mention in the Bendigo Advertiser on the 7th of January 1889. At the City Police Court, Mr M. Rundle JP was the only magistrate on the police bench on Saturday. C. Russell, known as the phrenologist, was again brought up for drunkenness and fined 5 shillings. There's an article referencing him a year later. At the Horsham Police Court yesterday, before the Mayor and Mr S. Bolton JP, a man named Black Scott Douglas was discharged with a caution for being drunk and disorderly. Again, 3 days later, at the police court on Wednesday, His Worship the Mayor had before him an offender named Black Scott Douglas for being drunk and disorderly, as it was only a day or two before that Douglas had been discharged with a caution. On this occasion, he was committed to Ararat Jail for 7 days. In 1926, it was recorded that Black Douglas had a pistol and it had been found. So it says bushranging days are recalled by a muzzle-loaded pistol, which has been received by Sub-Inspector Hall, head of the Russell Street Plainclothes branch, from Mr James Budge of Napier Street, South Melbourne. In an accompanying letter, Mr Budge says, "About 1857, a bushranger named Black Douglas held up a storekeeper known as Johnny Allsorts at German Gully between Castlemaine and Fryestown. After Douglas had left the place, this pistol was found lying on the counter. The storekeeper gave it to my father, who used to mind his cash and gold. My father lived in a bark hut and tent combined, about a quarter of a mile from the store. I used to hear a lot about Black Douglas, but I cannot remember that he was ever caught. Sub-Inspector Hall intends to present the pistol, which is engraved and mounted in silver, to the Castlemaine Art Gallery." And I came across an account from Adam Rye's family research. So Adam Rye had one experience at mining, and that was when the Bendigo rush broke out. He, with a party of 20, shouldered their swags and tramped to Bendigo. In crossing through the Black Forest, as it was then called, they met up with Black Douglas, a famous bushranger of the time. The party had just camped for the night when Douglas and men numbering 6 came on them. The party were all armed with guns and warned the rangers not to come any closer or they would fire. The robbers only had revolvers, so they thought it best to do as they were told. They, however, tried a couple of times during the night, but the miners were always ready for them, and at last Douglas came to the conclusion it was no use trying again. The bushrangers would have had a fair haul if they had succeeded, as each man was carrying a tidy sum of money at the time. In April 1891, William Douglas was jailed at Sandhurst for 6 months for vagrancy. He drifted from benevolent societies to imprisonment and back to benevolent societies until his death in 1892, whilst he was imprisoned. And he was named as Charles Russell in the reports on his death, and he died in the old Bendigo jail at the age of 75. He had recently been received on warrant from Rochester, Victoria, for vagrancy, and in the inquest Charles was listed as a half-caste native of England with no relatives in the colony. So some of the articles that mentioned his death, which gave a little more detail but also validated some facts as well. On Friday the 20th of May 1892, death of a notorious bushranger. A notorious criminal whose name was in the early 50s a terror to the colonists generally, and especially to diggers going to Melbourne, has just died in Bendigo Jail. This individual, Charles Russell, alias Black Douglas, was born at Bristol, England 75 years ago and arrived in the colonies while still a young man. At first he devoted himself to prize fighting, but afterwards turned his attention to bushranging and soon gained great notoriety for his lawless deeds. He was powerfully built, 6 foot 3 or 4 inches in height. Diggers returning him to Melbourne were frequently waylaid and robbed. One of his exploits was robbing a gold escort between Bendigo and Mackay. Eventually, however, he was captured. Since his release from imprisonment for those offences, he has served terms for petty crimes, and when he died, he was in jail under a sentence of 3 months. Of late years, he has been of rather quiet disposition and made pretense of being skilled in phrenology. And another account, a notorious character named Charles Russell, a coloured man, aged 75, that died on Sunday in Bendigo Hospital. The deceased claimed to have been known in the early 50s as Black Douglas the bushranger and took part in many escapades throughout the Midland districts of Victoria. On the 18th of May, another article with the title of The Deceased Phrenologist. Our morning contemporary and local correspondents of the Melbourne Press have made a ludicrous mistake in confusing the aged coloured man, Charles Russell, who died in Bendigo Jail on Monday, with Black Douglas, the noted bushranger of the 50s. Russell was never a bushranger, though it is said that in his earlier days he was a prize fighter. The name Black Douglas was never applied to him but once, and that was on its visit to the Bendigo Jail. And when inspecting some of the vagrancy inmates, one of the members of the Charities Commission, seeing Russell, jocularly remarked that he saw that he had got Black Douglas in custody. The Negro bushranger, who with his gang for a year or two was the terror of the goldfields, but disappeared from notice a third of a century ago. So that only popped up in 2 newspapers where there was a little bit of a dispute about whether Charles Russell was actually Black Douglas. However, when I delved deeply into old newspaper articles, Charles Russell was a name that had been mentioned quite a time previously. And the fact that he already had several aliases, I deduced Charles Russell was in fact William Douglas and the same man that had been referred to as Black Douglas since William Douglas arrived in Victoria in the early 1850s. The other interesting thing popped up, as mentioned earlier, about trying to kill his wife. I was going through some old jail records in Victoria. I typed in William Douglas, hoping that I might be able to find a jail photo of Black Douglas. And another William Douglas popped up. Now, this William Douglas was born in 1864 in Sandridge, Victoria. His trade, he listed as a jockey, so he must have been very small compared to what we know of as William Douglas, who was estimated as about 6'4". This man was 5'3". However, when I looked into this, I realised his date of conviction was 1878. So this wasn't a man we were talking about here, this was a boy. And this boy was born in that area of Victoria where William Douglas had been. His description was olive complexion, black hair, brown eyes, flat nose, black eyebrows. He had received 12 months imprisonment and 2 years hard labour for the conviction in February 1878 of larceny. He was convicted of horse stealing and receiving, and he was tried in the Prahran Petty Sessions. And the previous history of this young man stated that his mother was Margaret Douglas, living in Adelaide, and he had a sister Annie living in the Female Refuge in Melbourne, in Sunshine West. So I did have a little bit of a search, and there was a marriage record in South Australia at Gawler on the 25th of February 1858, a marriage between William Douglas and Margaret Parsons. And when looking at birth, death and marriages, there is a William Douglas and Margaret Parsons who had 4 children in Victoria. William Douglas in 1861, Mary Jane Douglas 1864, Thomas Douglas 1866, and Margaret Douglas in 1868, all born at Sandridge in Victoria. However, I'm unfortunately unable to find any further information other than the jail record of William Douglas. So there's a couple of articles that are linked to this William Douglas, and it says on the 7th of February 1878, William Douglas, a coloured youth, was cleverly arrested today by Detective Nixon and Ward on a charge of stealing £38 from a hotel in Malvern kept by Mr. E. Goff. The money was missed from the safe almost instantaneously with the disappearance of the youth, who was employed as a stable boy. The detectives arrested him at Spencer Street as he was about to start for Riddles Creek. But although the robbery only took place yesterday, the thief had been robbed of the greater portion of the money in a house of ill fame. And on the 17th of September 1879, a half-caste lad named William Douglas pleaded guilty to stealing a mare and was sentenced to 2 years. So he initially was placed in the Melbourne jail on the 14th of February 1878 and then transferred to Pentridge on the 26th of February 1878. He was discharged on the 13th of August 1879. This prisoner record, in fact, did have 2 very clear photos of this young man, and this young man is clearly African American from his features. It could be just a coincidence that he had that name of William Douglas, but the dates certainly do correlate that he could very well be his son. And unfortunately, at this point, I have tried to dig into a Margaret Douglas living at Adelaide. I've tried to dig into an Annie Douglas who may have been charged with vagrancy at some point as she was in a female refuge. But at this stage, I'm unable to find any further information to see whether this definitely links to whether William Douglas had a wife and actually had children.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes